Welcome to the world of rare disease, a show that focuses on awareness and education about rare and complex disorders. Today's show features RNE board member John Campbell and organization volunteer Lisa Deck, who will be discussing clinical trials and what they mean to patients and patient advocacy groups. Today's show is part 2 of a dialogue with Rare New England board member John Campbell. John is currently a clinical development director at a major pharmaceutical company and has 25 years industry experience in the pharmaceutical industry. John currently leads a team conducting global clinical trials in rare liver disease. In our last show, John discussed the roles and types of pharmaceutical companies that exist, what they can do for patients and patient advocacy groups, and helped explain the regulatory implications for companies in the rare disease community. Today, John will discuss clinical trials and what they mean to the patient. We will dive a bit deeper into how they work and how patients can learn and be involved with such trials. Welcome, John.
It's great to be here, Lisa. Thank you.
You're welcome. Can you tell us a bit about the drug development process and how long it takes for drugs to get to market?
Well, it takes a very long time. The average time is anywhere from 10 to 15 years from start to approval. It's a process that also costs a lot of money and requires a lot of different varied expertise within the pharmaceutical company. And then outside the pharmaceutical companies, it requires collaboration with a lot of other stakeholders in the process, including the investigators, the physicians. It also includes the regulatory bodies that we consult at various stages of the process. And most importantly, it involves the patient who guides us as to what's most important to them and what is clinically meaningful so that we provide drugs that are safe, effective, and provide relief where it's most needed.
Excellent. So a lot of time, a lot of money. And I know that we here at Rare New England work very closely with different pharma. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about clinical trials and how they can bring new medicines to the market.
Yes, so, again, the pharmaceutical company's job is to develop drugs, discover drugs, and then develop them. So this is a process, and the reason that it takes 10 to 15 years is that each step of the way there's checks and balances, and it really goes from discovery at the bench to finding targets. And we've made really great strides in being able to do that and identify at the genetic level targets that are based upon the specific disease that you're trying to treat. And then it enters into a series of clinical trials which are identified by phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And each phase builds upon the prior phase. And then phase 1 is the smallest phase. It's the first time that a drug is being introduced to humans. It is generally done in patients without the disease that's being treated. And the reason for that is to look at the safety specifically of the drug. And assuming that the drug passes that step, you'd move on to phase 2 clinical trials, where generally the goal there is to look at a number of different doses of the medicine you're trying to develop, and in patients that have the disease that you're trying to treat. And after phase 2, you go to phase 3, which is the largest phase. And this one you typically involve many centers across the country, across the globe, if it's a global trial. And this is where the focus really is on demonstrating the efficacy of the medicine under investigation. Safety is also a critical piece because as you expose more and more patients to the medicine, you get more and more information about unlikely side effects or things, ways that you can use a drug that minimize those side effects. And that can only be done in fairly large numbers of patients. And also the efficacy is the same principle. The more patients that you're able to involve in your clinical trials, the more confidence you can gain in the data that's generated. And the objective at the end is to have what's called a risk-benefit profile of the drug, so that the risks associated with patients with a certain specific condition, those risks are outweighed by the benefits that the drug provides.
I think it's like you knew the questions were coming, because I wanted to ask a little bit about the different phases. And I know this is a broad generalization, but what time frame do those usually take? Is phase 1, 2, and 3? Do you have an estimated time how that usually works?
Sure. It can vary depending upon the drug and depending upon the disease that you're trying to treat. The phase 1 generally has a small number of patients, just from a few patients all the way up to maybe just a dozen or so. And again, the phase 1 is really aimed at looking at the safety of the drug, usually in healthy volunteers is what we call them, patients without the disease. And that's usually done, again, depending in a research center. Sometimes the patients remain in the center for the duration of the phase 1 trial. And that can be anywhere from a day to a week, generally a short period of time. And then the phase 2, these are usually multi-center, a few centers, and you're looking at different doses. So this can take longer, depending again on your recruitment and the number of patients available. So really, it's hard to put a time on that duration, because it is so variable. And each phase, at the end of each phase, you spend some time making sure that the data you've collected is secure and appropriate. You validate those data, and then you lock everything down and then analyze it. And that happens after each successive stage. Usually in between certain phases of trials, you also have a meeting with the FDA where you'll discuss those data that you've generated in that trial and your future development plan that's based on those data. And then phase 3, again, that's the biggest phase, generally involving the most patients and the most sites, and will take the longest period of time. Frequently, the limiting factor is the availability of patients in your recruitment. This can depend on a number of things: the number of patients that are afflicted with the disease that are available for trials. It can also depend upon how difficult it is to enroll the trial, the eligibility criteria, if they're very strict or not so strict. That can add time to the overall duration of the phase. Typically, it's not one trial either. In phase 3, there could be a number of trials that you do that fall under the category of phase 3. And then at the end, all of the data from phase 3 and all the data prior are pulled together and put into a package that is then reviewed by the FDA to determine the safety and efficacy of the drug in the specific context that it's being used.
Wow, so it's a long, big process, and you just tried to narrow it down to explain it to us, so thank you for that. Can you talk a little bit about the risk-benefit profile of medications and how that might relate to patients participating in a trial?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's fascinating to me because really risk-benefit, as it relates to a medicine that's under investigation, it's a simple concept, and that is, the benefits of taking the medicine need to outweigh what the risks are. But if you think about that a little bit more deeply, you can begin to see that ratio, that risk-benefit, can be different according to whose perception you're talking about. So, in the United States, the FDA are mandated by Congress to protect public health. And that's how they look at the risk-benefit profile, overall population-based risk. They look at individual risk too, but their focus is to protect public health. So this medicine is approved, the side effects are known, and the benefits are known and demonstrated in that patient population. But the FDA's risk-benefit is only one. The other one could be the provider's risk-benefit, the clinicians. They may have some limitations as far as professional standards, as far as their own understanding of the disease and their approach to that disease. But I think the most important risk-benefit profile, and this is particularly true in rare disease scenarios, is that of the patients. If you have a trial with a medicine that's being investigated for a rare lethal disease, you can imagine that the patient really is willing to accept some risks in order to realize the potential benefit of the drug. And that's a difficult concept for the FDA, for instance. If you had a drug, let's say, for instance, that had a 20% chance of causing deafness, typically that would be a game showstopper for the FDA. But the patients would be very willing, perhaps, to give up some serious side effect for the potential life-saving benefit of the drug. So in rare disease situations, it's particularly important when you hear the risk profile that you think about whose perspective that's coming from. And as we get better in our clinical development approaches, we learn to incorporate more and more the perspective of the patient and the risk-benefit perspective that the patient brings to our design of clinical trials and our interpretation of the data.
Right. Rare disease definitely kind of has a tricky place in that because of, the lack of solutions. So very interesting to hear. There's a lot of questions that patients have when it comes to clinical trials. For example, do I need to come off my medicine to participate? Can you explain a little bit about clinical trial eligibility and how that works?
Sure, and this is a common question that patients have, as well as will there be a placebo in the trial? That's probably two of the biggest ones. So the eligibility criteria are put into a protocol, and this is what the investigator, the clinician, needs to use to determine if a patient can enter a trial. And the reason those eligibility criteria are there is to primarily protect the safety of the participants in the trial. Eligibility criteria are divided into two different buckets. One is inclusion criteria, and the other is exclusion criteria. So the inclusion criteria will identify the disease or a certain stage of the disease that the participant needs to have in order to be eligible. And there's a number of other things that might also be required in order for the patient to be eligible. The exclusion criteria, which, using your example, Lisa, for a certain medication and the decision whether or not you need to come off that to enter the trial, it's typically a difficult one. And it could be a safety concern, so that the unknown effects of the drug that you're testing in the trial may have an interaction with another drug that you're taking. And that could potentially be a safety issue for the patient that you want to avoid. Another scenario is that the drug that you're taking could interfere with your ability to interpret the results in the trial. So you're not only protecting the patient, but you're also protecting the integrity of the data that you're generating in the trial. And the reason for that is that at the end of the trial, you need to be able to make sense of the data. And if there are factors there, such as medications that the patients are taking, that have the potential to confound the results, that is not fair to all of the participants that are partaking in the trial. I can tell you that it's not an easy decision. It's taken with great consideration when these eligibility criteria are established in a protocol. Pharmaceutical companies have physicians within the company, as well as we consult with experts outside of the company who are specialists in the disease that you're treating. And you talk these things out, and at the end of the day, as the protocol is developed, it really is a consensus based upon the safety. So sometimes patients do need to come off their drug, and this is a question that you should ask the center or your personal primary care doctor before you enter into a trial.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I am a patient, and I know I have been involved before in a clinical trial, but what advice do you have for patients who are considering being part of a clinical trial?
Another good question. There's a lot of information out there on clinical trials. I'm in a unique position in some regards because I work for a pharmaceutical company, and I deal on a daily basis with the struggle to enroll trials that we have ongoing. And then I also volunteer as an R&E board member and frequently have exposure to patients who come to our events and they say, I can't find information about a trial. I don't know how to sign up, and it's that dichotomy that is frustrating at times. I think the number one thing that you should really do if you're considering a trial is to speak with your physician, whether that be your primary care doctor or your specialist, and talk to them about the risks, benefits of the trial and the information that you have. That physician can usually help you or go over information that is available at different websites and understand the individual risks that you might incur and potential benefits, because that is an individual decision. So I'd say talk to your doctor, and also you can consult information sources out there, making sure that you consult many different sources, and you check the sources and where that information is coming from. Another very important avenue for information about clinical trials and whether or not you want to participate in it are patient advocacy groups. These groups are generally formed around a disease or a group of diseases, or in R&E's case, all of rare diseases. And there's likely patients there who have a similar struggle or have made the same decisions already that you're trying to make, and they could provide you really valuable information about what to consider as you make your own decisions.
Excellent. Well, thank you. One question when we were kind of prepping for the show we were thinking about was, you sometimes hear about patients who are seeing benefits from a medication, and then for reasons outside of their control, the trial has to stop. Can you talk a little bit about why that might happen, that's one of those tough situations, but I'm sure there's an explanation, and just wanted to kind of talk through that.
Yes, that can happen. And there's a document that you sign before you participate in a trial, and it's called an informed consent document. And this explains, in layman's terms, everything that you'll need to do and what the potential outcomes are with respect to your participation or the discontinuation of the trial. So it's very important that you understand that and ask questions as you go through that informed consent process with the investigator. The trials can be discontinued for a number of reasons. One of the best reasons for that is because there's overwhelming evidence of efficacy, and the drug has been shown to be safe. So it's no longer ethical to continue with a clinical trial, and then you would proceed to review by the FDA immediately. Another opposite example is that if the trial is ongoing and it's clear that there's a safety signal that poses risk to the patients, or that the drug is not working, which is also a risk, the way that you had hoped. For instance, if you're moving from phase 2 to phase 3 and now in a larger number of patients, you start to see things that you couldn't see in the smaller number of patients. That can be a reason for discontinuation, whether that's a decision that could be made by the FDA. It's a decision that could also be made by a safety monitoring committee in collaboration with the research folks at the pharmaceutical company. It's rare for drugs that are in a trial for that trial to be discontinued for other reasons, but there are other reasons. Companies can run out of funding. The companies can no longer be invested in that particular therapeutic area, and no longer are able to continue funding trials which cost a lot of money. Typically, though, the companies will support the study to play out through a patient's participation in the trial, if at all possible.
Excellent. So there's a lot of information about clinical trials, and I'd love to kind of leave the last question a bit open-ended about what is your look at the future of clinical trials? What is your hope for the future? Things are moving fast, so I'd love to hear kind of some last words of advice from you.
So I think we're at a crossroads now, and it really is almost a crisis, I would say, because these data are available, but since 1950, about every 9 years, the number of drugs that are approved is approximately halved. So it's taking longer and longer to get drugs through the clinical trial process and approved, and it's taking more and more expertise and resources, money, in order to do that. And this is despite really an explosion in the tools available to discover new targets and new drugs that are eligible for trials. The advances in genetics have been remarkable. So despite all these advances, there really hasn't been a concomitant increase in the number of drugs that are approved. So clearly, the approach of putting more potential drugs into the clinical trial funnel, if you will, is not the way to go. And I think what I'm very encouraged about, and what I'd like to see in the future, and I think it's going to be a necessity, is what's called the translational science and improvements in the science of clinical trials, so that we can better use the tools we have, the genetics, as well as streamlining the clinical development process and the review process, having very unique designs, adaptive clinical trial designs that aren't the standard compare one thing to another and compare it to placebo, but instead trials that are adaptive in a way that depends upon how the patient is responding to the drug that you're giving them. So I think these improvements are on the horizon, and it's going to take, again, a village for us to make this happen. We're going to need the patient's willingness to participate in the trials. We're going to need the clinicians who act as our investigators, and we're going to need the pharmaceutical companies and the academics to design the trials and push things through. So improvements that translate into the ability to more quickly and more efficiently study medicines is on the horizon, and I think not just me, but all of my colleagues in pharma and the patients that need these medicines are eagerly awaiting.
Excellent. Sounds like a good plan. I hope that comes to fruition. So now we kind of come to the end of our show, RNE in Motion. It's a segment that we do at the end of each show. Before closing each show, we provide our viewers with an opportunity to share comments and ask questions. During each show, we will read our questions sent in from previous shows and provide answers. Today we have a question from Alex. The question from Alex says, how does a patient get involved in clinical trials? And our answer for him is there are various ways to get involved in clinical trials. The first is you can go to the website clinicaltrials.gov. That has a very extensive list of ways to find clinical trials. You can also talk to your primary care physician or go to different patient advocacy groups. So those are all different ways that patients are able to find clinical trials that they can participate in. So again, we invite you to send in some questions or comments from today's show. We will answer them during next week's Rare New England in Motion segment on our next show. That's our show for today. Thank you, John, for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Please let us know your comments about the show and email us with any questions you have about today's topic. We will respond during the next show. From all of us here at Rare New England and all the patients and families who keep rare disease in motion, thank you for watching. And remember, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses and zebras.